So 4 years ago, the Secretary of State invited me into her office and offered me one of the best jobs in the entire State Department. And yesterday, I resigned. And I want to tell you why, because the answer, which I am talking about today for the first time, is going to change the world. It used to be that if you wanted to change the world, you had a pretty limited set of options. And it usually involved getting a whole bunch of old men together in a room, plying them liberally with tobacco and bourbon, and hoping that they could come up with a solution to whatever problem was vexing you. On the whole, frankly, the system has had pretty mixed results, but occasionally you would get lucky. And one of these times happened about 70 years ago in a place called Bretton Woods in New Hampshire, when a group of governmental representatives got together to address some huge challenges facing the global economy. And they built a series of institutions, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, that today provide the architecture for the entire world economy, and on the whole have served us pretty well over the last 70 years. Now, in the last century, the world has gotten a lot more complicated. And frankly, the systems that we used to solve problems in 1944 don't work today. Part of that is because we have a lot more actors at the table, and in some ways that's a very good thing. In addition to government, now we have the private sector, which plays an extraordinarily important role, and we have civil society. Civil society is where we come together in civic organizations, in community groups, at TED conferences, and we work through peaceful means to make the world a better place. Now, civil society itself isn't new at all. If we think about our experience as Americans, civil society led to our initial independence. It brought us the abolition of slavery and rights for women, and many of the other critical social advances that we've experienced throughout our history. But in the last few years, as a result of advances in technology and shifts in culture, it's become easier and cheaper than it's ever been before to bring people together around common ideas and unite them in civil society. And that's led to a tenfold increase in the number of civil society organizations around the world. My job at the State Department was to lead a team that worked like a venture capital fund in finding the best ideas we could on the planet for strengthening civil society and new democracies, and then bringing together the talent, the technology, the resources, and partners necessary to help those great ideas come to life. It was incredible work in part because of the amazing people that you got to work with. In Latin America, we worked with one group that had brought together an army of volunteer accountants, over 1,000, to do a crowdsourced review of a national budget that uncovered tens of millions of dollars in corruption. In Papua New Guinea, we saw civil society organizations that were providing 70% of all the health care in the entire country. And we saw groups in country after country after country that were working to address conflicts before they devolved into crises. So the work was incredibly inspiring, but unfortunately at times it could also be kind of depressing. And that's because in so many of these cases, the organizations that were doing incredible work and delivering incredible value for society didn't have enough resources. Most of them operated on a shoestring budget, and they couldn't accomplish anything close to what they would have been able to if they'd had access to adequate funding. This was especially troubling because I knew as a representative of the US government, there was only so much that we would be able to do about it. Our financing for these types of programs has barely budged over the last 20 years, and it's not going to increase anytime soon. And frankly, it was even more frustrating because the private sector has figured out how to solve this. For the most part, wherever you are in the world right now, it has never been easier to get financing to manufacture widgets. But it is still incredibly difficult to get resources to manufacture change. I was speaking about this a while ago up in Boston and feeling a little bit sorry for myself and all of the great social entrepreneurs around the world who are trying to bring about change. And at the end of my presentation, a guy came up to me and he said, "I've got to talk to you." And what I didn't know then is that he was one of the leading thinkers in the financial sector. And he said, "I figured something out. I know it's very important, but I don't know what to do with it. And I'm hoping that you'll be able to help." If you think his firm advised some of the biggest investors in the world, pension funds, charitable endowments, and sovereign wealth funds, which are essentially the investment vehicles for countries that have so much money they don't know what else to do with it. And together, these three categories of investors control about $25 trillion, just a mind-boggling amount of money. And in addition, to put it in context, that's about 1 out of every $5 in financial markets all over the world. And in addition to having just a mind-bending amount of money at their disposal, they also have a couple of other things in common. They're incredibly long-term investors. Their time horizons stretch out many decades into the future. And they're also highly, highly diversified. They're in every region, they're in every sector of the world, every sector of the global economy, and frankly, they're too big to hide from market volatility. When the world does well, they prosper. When the world does badly, they take it on the chin. And here's where it started to get really, really interesting. There's 60 seconds of math involved. Stay with me, and I promise I won't use math again. If you are a big pension fund, say the Texas Teachers Retirement System, which has about $100 billion, and you put $1 into the markets at a steady 8% rate of return over 50 years, at the end of that process, you're getting $46 back. And all but $5 of that increase is the result of compounded interest, what Einstein called the eighth wonder of the world. Take that same $1, though, and invest it at an average at 8% rate of return over 50 years, but inject a 20% standard deviation so that the return graph, instead of being a straight line, looks a little bit more like the Rocky Mountains. Instead of getting $46 back in returns, you're getting $18 back. And that loss is due entirely to the effect of market volatility. The fact that when the markets go up and down, you're not able to compound interest at the same rate. And this financial genius took me aside and he said, I've figured out that the way to address market volatility is to invest in civil society. Because these are the organizations that are dealing with all of the underlying causes of market volatility that are killing the long-term investment results of my clients. To think about this a different way, go back to Colorado, where I grew up. It used to be that if you wanted to go from the low ground to the high ground in Colorado, you had one option, and that was to hire a mule train and go over the mountains as you found them. This was incredibly difficult, incredibly dangerous, it took forever, and it entailed a lot of up and down. Eventually, fortunately, somebody figured out that if we were willing to make an investment, if we were willing to take some time and some energy, you could smooth out that path. And a journey that would have taken days can now be completed before breakfast in time to get you to the slopes. We've seen this same phenomenon play out in other countries. We don't have to accept the terrain as we find it. We can change the landscape. In South Korea, after the Korean War, the country's economy was entirely decimated. They had absolutely nothing left. And over the course of about 30 years, the United States invested $30 billion. Today, South Korea has a $1 trillion economy, $1 trillion in market capitalization in its stock markets. And we as Americans export $40 billion every year to that market. This is incredible return on investment. And frankly, it's a good indication that this can work. And we've seen it in many other cases as well. There's some of you in the audience who are going to be saying, that's a nice story, but it doesn't really apply to me, because I keep my money back home in America, and I don't have to worry about any of these things that are going on in the rest of the world. You don't need to look much beyond the last few weeks of news to realize that's just not the case. One of the first financial victims of the Ebola crisis was the stock holdings of American airlines. If you look at the crisis in Ukraine, it has resulted in incredibly harsh sanctions on poultry producers in the United States, something that none of us would have anticipated. And the One Foundation just released data a couple of days ago showing that we are paying $1 trillion a year to cover the cost of corruption worldwide. So if you are engaged at all in the world economy, you've got skin in this game. The news gets even more complicated when you look beyond the last couple of weeks of news. As Americans, we think about investment results going up forever, because that's been our experience as a country. But think about the 20th century experience of places like China or Russia or Germany. At times in those countries, the value of investments fell to effectively zero. And in each case, it was preceded by the collapse of civil society. So what are we going to do about it? We have this incredibly powerful knowledge that has the potential not only to change the world in which we live and make it a much better place, but also to be incredibly profitable. Starting immediately, we're bringing together many of the best analytical minds in the world and some of the world's leading management consultants to figure out what types of social investment are going to help reduce market volatility in different countries around the world. We've engaged some of the world's leading advocacy organizations to help convince those who control the endowments of universities, big pension funds and sovereign wealth funds, that this is something that makes sense for them to do over the long run. And we're engaging with some of the world's leading financial institutions to design new tools to help support the work of civil society and develop the technologies to track these investments and their impact. And then finally, we're going to go back to Bretton Woods and bring together a group for a meeting that we're calling Bretton Woods II, that instead of involving the representatives of government, is going to draw on the representatives of the private sector and civil society, including these pension funds, charitable endowments, and sovereign wealth funds. And we're going to get them to do three things. The first is to commit at least 1% of their holdings to social impact investment. Cumulatively, that's $250 billion. And to put that in context, that's about 100 times what the United States spends on democracy and governance worldwide each year. Second, we're going to get them to commit to follow the example of one of the largest US pension funds, CalPERS, and only invest in countries that commit to standards of good governance and accountability. This creates a multi-trillion-dollar incentive for countries to do the right thing and help build that landscape that we want to create. And finally, we're going to seek tax changes and regulatory changes that will encourage this type of investment over the long term. Ultimately, this is the right thing to do, but it's also, frankly, the smart thing to do. And it doesn't matter so much whether you're going to sleep better at night if you follow this approach, because you're going to have a much higher thread count on your sheets every evening. How can you help? Most of you don't control a pension fund, a charitable endowment, or a sovereign wealth fund. But if you do, you should definitely come talk to me during the break. If you are involved in a retirement account, you have a stake in this effort. And you should be letting your retirement account know that you want them to be thinking about the very long term. If you contribute to the endowment of a university, you need to be weighing in with the trustees and ensuring that they understand that they have a chance to shape the landscape that we're investing in. But most importantly, think about what type of world you want to be living in 50 years and invest in that future. When I was growing up in Colorado, we used to tell the story of two brothers who were not, frankly, the sharpest tools in the shed. But one day they decided that they wanted to make a little bit of money. And so they went and they got a whole load of watermelons for $1 each. And they loaded them into a truck. They drove over to the county fair, and they sold them for $1 each. Next day they went back, they did the same thing. Bought a whole load of melons for $1 each, drove over to the county fair, sold them for $1 each. And finally, by the third day, even these guys were realizing that this just wasn't working out the way they anticipated. And one of them turned to the other and said, I'm not sure what the problem is, but we're just not getting ahead. And his brother thought for a long time. Finally, he turned to him and he said, I've got it. We need a bigger truck. And I share this story because too often when we go out to change the world, what we look for is a bigger truck, when in fact what we need is a better business model. I believe that Bretton Woods II is part of that business model, and that if we succeed in directing new resources to support the work of civil society and social impact investment, we're not just going to help advance an agenda, we're going to be purchasing stock in the future of humankind. And that's one investment opportunity that none of us can afford to pass up. Thank you.